thing.
Boa tarde.
Probably. Yeah, hopefully there's a clicker.
Good afternoon. I love this audience. Loads of people, new faces. First of all, I would like to thank Fidelidade Culturgest for having invited me to be here with you today in this panel. My name is Carla Canivete. I'm a senior editor in Bloomberg News. I have worked a lot on questions on energy, economy. We've been working around sustainability. And as a journalist, I would like to begin by introducing the topic with the news. And I would like to remind you that about a year ago, we were preparing COP26, which took place in Glasgow. And we had the presence of economic agents, leaders in the government, investors. So there was a great interest in what we were doing with the planet, what we could do in terms of sustainability and the climate, including agents like BlackRock CEO, BlackRock City, who normally send delegations, were present, meaning that this question of sustainability and energy was a rage. And so then we get to this year, Russia invaded Ukraine, and so we saw that all this power going towards clean energy and sustainability, and these things that worried us ended up by being totally ignored. And so this year, all these CEOs, or some of them, are going to send delegations instead of going themselves, because since gas was cut, since it became, because we have a need to heat up our houses, we have our factories working, everything that was belonged to sustainability and climate ended up by being a concern of second importance. And so it's within this context that we are here today to discuss the conflicts between energy, economy, and sustainability. That is how we're going to continue to create comfort, how we're going to create economic growth without using up the economic, hydric, physical resources that get our world to move. So I've got two people who are going to help me discuss this. One is Tiago Domingos, who's a professor of the environment energy in the Instituto Técnico. Tiago has worked on the sustainability of natural resources. He's the founder of a company which is Terra Prima, that works with the way we can use the soil, the way we can farm responsibly and sustainably. And I have Daniel Olin as well, who is a professor of the environmental economy and economic ecology in the University of Leeds. And he wrote his very interesting book called Enough is Enough, and he's worked on this question of how we can work and take the resources from the world, the resources that are necessary, and so we can do good, but without taking out too much. So having said this, I'm much more interested in hearing them and just hearing what you have to say than hearing myself. So I'm going to give the floor to Tiago, who's going to be our first speaker. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about thermodynamics in a while, and the fundamental lesson that thermodynamics has for us is that time only moves forward and not backwards. So I thought this pointer was an excellent tool to learn thermodynamics, but it's not. So I can go forward and backwards. So first of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be here and talk about these subjects and really I would like to see how how energy is key to understand economic growth and what implications this have, and to think about the sustainability of economic growth and its relationships with different matters, namely carbon neutrality, which is something that we collectively want to reach till 2020, so as we don't suffer from severe climate change. Very quickly and in an easy way to explain the problem that I'm going to talk about today is we have CO2 emissions, and we want to divide them in three contributions. The contribution that comes from the energy system, which is CO2 in a unit of energy. The contribution of the economic activity, that is much energy. Do I need a GDP unit, and how much energy do I need to create a unit of economic growth? And finally, the GDP itself. And so to reduce CO2 emissions, we can only do this in three ways. We can that is decarbonize the energy system. That is through wind, sun, solar energy. Reduce energy intensity. That is to use less energy for a created economic growth unit. And finally, to reduce the GDP, which is rather controversial because we have to consider it, and it's a possibility that Dan O'Neill after me will discuss. And what is very clear, and this is consensual, there's no model, there's no scenario that ignores this. The problem is not solvable only through the decarbonisation of the energy system. That is through the transition of energy system to the use of renewable energies. That is not enough. But at the same time, we must act instead of in terms of the energy that we use to create economic growth. We cannot do it sufficiently quick. We can do one sufficiently quick, we have to do two, and maybe we have to do three. But the third, but I'm going to leave the third part for Dan. And then we have to make the difference between energy and GDP, and that's what I'm going to focus about. And that is to reduce the energy intensity of GDP. Another fundamental component of the context, that is from a strictly economic viewpoint, is what we see in our societies and also developed societies. And it's expressed here in this chart. The economic growth has become slower, and this phenomenon is beginning to affect the more advanced developing economies, and the most obvious example is China. And so when this happens, and given that we have this model of society where the satisfaction of people's needs is based on a growth of their material wealth, and so we have a society rather like China is going to face these political problems in terms of the legitimacy of a political system that no longer gives the growth in material prosperity that the people were used to. So the twin problems that I'm going to discuss: the need to comply with climatic rules and the social problems problems by the drop in economic growth, both lead to the need to understand the process of economic growth. We have the Portuguese case here, and we see the evolution of the Portuguese GDP over recent decades, always growing. GDP is quite linear, which means that there has been growth rates of 6 or 7% in the 70s, 3 or 4 in the 80s, 3 or 4 in the 90s, and 0 for the last 20 years. A little bit more than 0. And so we saw this in the previous chart. In order to understand the phenomena that occur with GDP, we have to understand what causes economic growth. For the economists, it's easy to think where they have to look. That is all the money that constitutes the GDP, all the money that consumers pay companies. That is those who supply the material, the owners, the machines, the land, and those who provide the work. Capital and labour are both fundamental. components. So if we combine them, a third for capital, that just saves us a third of the GDP, two-thirds of labour, which is two-thirds of GDP. We have this red line. So the evolution of the capital and labour over time is unable to explain GDP. So we have to make a number of corrections here in order to improve the way we see capital and labour. Some university students who take a course are going to be more productive in the economic value. We have to take this into account. And so we still have this huge distance between the green line and blue line, which the economists cannot explain why this happens, and that is a total productivity of factors. And so this is throughout the evolution of economies. In this case, the Portuguese in 50 years, the businessmen, managers have become much more efficient and intelligent using machines and people in order to increase the economy. They've become 3 times more efficient. Now, this is obviously not plausible. Suddenly, the management technologies to make this progress over a period of 50 years. And so there's a difference that you can see between the green line and blue line is a fundamental puzzle in economic science. And here I'm going to show you, this is what we've been developing together with international partners, some of the colleagues of Dan and Neil in the University of Leeds, and that is we had to use physics and engineering to solve an open problem in economies. So we use the laws of thermodynamics, in particular a concept that we know of thermodynamics, which called exergy. X should be there. Exergy is not the same as energy, and so the concept appears from the need to explain the statement: a bulb spends energy is. And a statement that can only be wrong, because as Lavoisier said that before he literally lost his head in the French Revolution, and nothing is lost as nothing is gained, everything transforms. So energy cannot be saved because it's conserved, and so actually it cannot be spent because it's saved. And so the bulb degrades the energy. Electricity that goes into a bulb can carry out work much more than the light and the heat that comes from the bulb. So the electricity that goes into the bulb has got more exergy that can exert an effect on the world than the input electricity than the output, that is heat and light. So when people say turn the light out, you're using up a lot of energy, say no, I'm not using up energy, I'm using up exergy. So another concept which is important, that is, in our economies, energy goes through a number of states. So before it goes through any transformation, think about coal. Coal in the subsoil, which has no human intervention. We call this the primary phase. And then this coal is transferred through a thermoelectric plant, but it uses electricity. This is an example of something we want to do less, but we still do it a lot. And then we have the production of final energy, which is electricity, and this electricity gets to the lamp. And you can note that this is a critical point I want to convey to you. Electricity, it doesn't cause us any well-being. It causes a feeling of it. It's a bad feeling. So, for example, there's a bulb which produces light. This is a useful phase. That is the transformation of energy, which creates economic value. And so in this chart, there's an empirical demonstration of the Portuguese case over the last 150 years that shows that the statement I've just made is true. In the last 150 years in Portugal, so if you look at the yellow line, the final energy, electricity, gas, petrol, etc., are divided by the GDP. And so the line is disappearing. So the economists will look at this, look at the blue line, and they say, good news, we need less and less energy to creating economic value, because this blue line is decreasing. This is an illusion, because if you look exactly what creates economic value, this is a useful phase, which is the red line. It's constant. For 150 years, we need a certain amount of energy in order to produce economic value. And 150 years later, we still need the same quantity of energy to produce economic value. And we have a problem, and which we will discuss later throughout this session, which is how we're going to solve this problem, because we have seen at the beginning, if we do not reduce the amount of energy by the economic value that people use, we cannot comply with the objectives of carbon neutrality, stabilize the climate, and of course we will discuss how we can do this. And two, sum up the initial problem I mentioned, this chart, the difference between the green line and the blue line, and also a fraction that of economic growth that the economy can explain. The truth is that when we use this concept, which I introduced, that is a useful exergy, the cool air from air conditioning, but all sorts of different things in the economy. This energy is a better way to measure the contribution that equipment makes. And so when we measure the machinery according to their capacity to make energy, the factors are explained. The problem in economy is solved by looking at the system physically and stating that that machines, what are machines for is to make energy available. And so I'm going to finish off with this what we call a parabola of an English farmer. So look at this photograph. So let's imagine it's an English farmer 300 years ago. He ploughed the land with a horse. It wasn't very productive, and so what did he do? He only made enough food for his family, and all Englishmen were farmers. And 300 years changed. The farmer works on a horse with a 300cc, and so that means that this tractor farmer is 100 times more productive because of the tractor. How do I know this is true? Because 1% of farmers, this statistics is true, 1% of farmers, of Englishmen today are farmers and produce food for all the others. So why doesn't the economy capture this effect? Because by using physics, we know that the tractor is 100 times more productive than a horse. It has the power of 100 horses, and so the economy looks at the tractor, says it costs 30,000 euros, and it says that the horse costs 3,000 euros, and says that it's 10 times more productive than a horse. No, because the economic measure is not taking into account the true value of the tractor. And so the essential message that I wanted to convey to you is that we cannot understand economic growth without thinking of energy, and this obviously brings a number of implications on how we should make the transition to carbon neutrality and how we can maintain economic growth or not. And so that's a question that we can discuss later. Thank you.
Obrigada, Tiago. Interessante esta nova palavra que podemos.
Thank you very much. This new word that we can bring into our discussions. Now I'm passing the floor to Daniel. I forgot to mention at the beginning that part of the session is going to be spoken in English, which is the case for Daniel. And whenever I speak with Daniel, we are going to speak in English as well. So we have a simultaneous interpretation, so if you want, and if you don't have the earphones, please pick them up.
Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. at this very exciting event. And Tiago has explained to us about the complex relationship between energy and economic growth. And it's hard to deny the importance of energy to the economy, especially when we're in the middle of a global supply crisis, a global cost of living crisis. And there are essentially two ways to get out of such a crisis. On the one hand, we could produce more energy, and on the other hand, we could consume less energy. The problem is that our entire economic system really struggles with this goal of producing less. If we try to buy less, consume less, produce less, the result is recession, unemployment, clearly undesirable. And at the same time, energy is not the only resource upon which our economies depend. There are many other resources that are also important, such as minerals, timber, water, land, and so on. As the global economy has grown, we've had to shovel in more resources, and we have created more wastes. What I want to talk to you about today is the alternative. How would we manage an economy if the goal is no longer growth, if the goal is instead meeting human needs within the finite limits of our planet? Before I do that, though, I want to touch on three of the reasons that we might question the continued pursuit of growth in wealthy nations. The first of these is environmental. There was a very interesting study that was done a few years ago, which was published in big journals like Science and Nature, in which the authors attempted to quantify the safe operating space for humanity on this planet. And the authors identified 9 planetary boundaries related to key Earth system processes, and you can see them here. And the study has been continually updated over the years, and in the latest update, they've found that we are now transgressing 6 of these planetary boundaries. And of course, you can see them here: climate change, biosphere integrity, land system change, novel entities. This is largely things like plastic pollution, the biogeochemical flows of phosphorus and nitrogen, and freshwater use. And when this study first came out, the authors issued quite a dire warning. They said that transgressing 1 or more of the planetary boundaries could lead to catastrophic change at the continental to global scale. And here we are transgressing 6 of them. The second reason we might question growth is social. Data are now widely available from surveys of happiness and life satisfaction. And if we look at these data over time, what we see is that in many wealthy nations, although GDP has tripled since 1950, happiness has not increased. These data are for the US, but it looks very similar in European countries. And this led the Canadian economist Peter Victor to say that Americans have been more successful decoupling GDP from happiness than in decoupling it from material and energy. Clearly not what we want. The third reason we might question growth is largely practical. And Tiago also showed a very similar chart to this, that growth rates are declining in many nations. So the data I've put up here show the per capita GDP growth in high-income nations. That's countries with an average income over $12,700 per year. This is the World Bank definition. And what you see is that the trend rate of growth has been gradually decreasing since the 1960s. So high-income countries are being faced to deal with low economic growth, whether they want to or not. And if we continue to extrapolate this trend, then within the next decade or so, there will be no growth in these countries. And that has led many economists to really question whether growth can continue. It seems that inventions like Facebook, mobile phones, are not having the same kind of transformative effects on our economies as previous inventions like electricity, the automobile, or as pictured here, indoor plumbing. So if the goal is no longer growth, what should the goal of our societies be? Well, a good starting point might be the donut of social and planetary boundaries put forward by the economist Kate Raworth. Raworth argues that our resource use should be high enough to meet people's basic needs, and that's the social foundation, but not so high that we go crashing through the ecological ceiling. And she describes the donut-shaped space in between as a safe and just space for humanity. Now, one of the things I've done in my own research is to try to quantify how different countries do on this donut framework. And I'm going to share some of the data with you. So here are the data for Portugal. And let me walk you through this. So the blue wedges here, whoops. The blue wedges here show social performance in relation to the social foundation. And then the green wedges show how we're doing with respect to ecological limits. And we want the social indicators to reach this social foundation, but we don't want the ecological indicators to go through the ecological ceiling, as they clearly are here. Anything that's in red in this diagram is bad. It's either social shortfall or ecological overshoot. So what we see for Portugal is that Portugal's doing relatively well on the social indicators. It achieves 7 of the 11, but it's doing so at the expense of all of the ecological boundaries, transgressing all of the ecological boundaries. We might contrast this with a developing country like Sri Lanka, does very well on all of the ecological indicators, but only achieves 3 of the social indicators. Okay, well, what happens when we look at a whole bunch of countries? Well, here's a whole bunch of countries. What we see in this diagram is that, in general, countries that have done well on the social indicators have done so by transgressing the ecological boundaries. And here again is Portugal, and here is Sri Lanka. The problem is that, of course, where we want to be is up here in the top left-hand corner, where no country currently is. Now, where this gets really interesting is if we start looking at the relationships between the individual indicators in the donut. Okay? So I'm just going to show you 2 of them here to give you an idea. But here's healthy life expectancy and CO2 emissions. But I could have picked almost any pair of social and environmental indicators from the donut, and it would look really similar to this. It would be a relationship with diminishing returns. So what we see is that at low levels of resource use, a small increase in resource use leads to fairly dramatic improvements in human well-being. But beyond some turning point, you get very little additional benefit for the extra resource use. And this means that wealthy countries like the US could reduce their resource use and move back along this curve, perhaps to where Portugal is, without a real decline in human well-being. The reason we don't do this, of course, is the economic system is not set up to do it. We're living in a type of rat race economy where more is always the goal, where happiness is, in theory, just around the corner, but somehow we never seem to get there. Now, the thing is, it doesn't need to be this way. There is an alternative. And ecological economists have been working on the economics of an economy without growth, what we call a steady-state economy or post-growth economy, for many years. My own contribution in this space is the book that Carla mentioned, Enough is Enough. There's also a short film on YouTube, if you're interested, which explores some of the changes that are needed to achieve a steady-state economy. Now, at its simplest, a steady-state economy would have 4 basic characteristics. The first of these is sustainable scale, and that just means energy and material use are within ecological limits. The second is fair distribution or limits to inequality. We need to make sure that the gap between the rich and poor is not too large, and there's a strong social argument for this. It's been shown that societies with higher levels of inequality tend to have more health and social problems. The third feature is efficient allocation. And for any of you who've studied economics, you spend a lot of time on efficient allocation, and it's something that markets are good at delivering, at least for certain types of goods and services, and we need to use the power of markets, but we also need to recognize where markets work and where markets don't work and use them appropriately. And finally, we need to shift our focus away from growth in GDP towards high quality of life, towards the things that genuinely matter to people, such as health, happiness, leisure time, and community. Okay, so can we actually do this? Or is it all just some sort of nice hippie dream? Well, one of the first people to try to test this was the Canadian economist Peter Victor, and he built a computer simulation model for the Canadian economy to explore low growth scenarios. And I won't go through all the details of this model or subsequent models that have been built for other countries like this, but Peter Victor showed that it's possible to have full employment, more leisure time, to balance the budget, to reduce poverty to historically low levels, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, all without economic growth, at least in Canada. Okay, that's great, but how do we do it? Well, let me give you 5 of the policy changes that would be needed. The first is to limit resource use. At the moment, macroeconomically, we don't have that many controls on the use of resources and the emission of pollutants. We can think of some successful examples, like the Montreal Protocol, which limits the release of ozone-depleting substances. And because of this international agreement, the ozone layer is largely expected to recover by 2050. And for me, this is a really interesting one because my first job back in 1995 was for the Canadian Ministry of the Environment working on the implementation of the Montreal Protocol. So it's nice to see that something actually worked. In a steady state economy, we need more sorts of policies like this. We need to impose strict limits on the use of resources like fossil fuels, forests, and fisheries, and on the emission of pollutants like CO2. And we should set these limits based on ecological criteria using the best science that's available. And once we've set these limits, we can use economic tools like cap and trade system or ecological tax reform to stay within them. And I'm not really going to say much more about this because we have the economic tools. It's just a question of actually using them. And for me, what's really interesting is what actually happens when we try to do this. How do we socially manage this transition if we start limiting resource use? What are the implications? And one of the first ones we have to deal with is inequality. And in a steady state economy, we need to think of ways to limit inequality. Now, economic growth is often used as an excuse to avoid dealing with inequality. We're told that a rising tide lifts all boats, if you happen to have a nice boat like this one. Henry Wallach, who is a former governor of the Federal Reserve in the US, he once said that growth is a substitute for equality of income. So long as there is growth, there is hope. And that makes large income differentials tolerable. Well, hold on a second here. If growth is a substitute for equality, then greater equality is also a substitute for growth, and arguably a much better policy both for the environment and society. Now, in a steady state economy, if we don't have growth, we no longer have that as an excuse. We need to deal with the issue of inequality explicitly. And one of the ways we might do that would be to have a minimum and a maximum income throughout society. Now, by a minimum income, I don't mean a low hourly wage conditional on working at McDonald's. I mean something like a universal basic income which is available to all citizens regardless of whether they're working or not. Or an alternative proposal is something called universal basic services. Either way, the idea is that we provide a social floor that ensures that people's basic needs are met. Now, a maximum income might be more controversial, particularly if you have one of the nice yachts like in the previous slide, but surely no more controversial than the current system where in the US, for instance, top CEOs have incomes 670 times the amount of the average worker in their companies. But again, it wasn't always this way. Things actually used to be kind of different, and the reason for this was taxes. So here's the highest marginal tax rate in the US, and what you can see was up until 1964, it was over 90%. So this is almost a maximum income in the United States, and currently it's 37%. And we've seen a drop in many countries over time in the highest marginal tax rate, and I would argue we need to move back to a system which was more similar to what we had for taxation in the 1960s. Third thing we need to do, and this is my personal favorite, in theory at least, is to reduce working hours. Currently, we use the benefits of technological progress to produce more stuff. What do I mean by this? Well, let's say I work in a factory, and it takes me 8 hours to produce one of these cups. One day, though, perhaps due to my university education, I figure out a way to produce these cups twice as quickly. Does this mean I get to go home at noon? Well, no. It means we produce twice as many cups. And then our marketing department has to go out and try to convince people to buy these extra cups with witty slogans like, "1 cup is not enough." Otherwise, I'm out of a job. In a steady state economy, though, we can't keep ramping up production just to keep people employed. Remember the planetary boundaries. What we can do, though, is almost blindingly obvious. We can use the benefits of technological progress to reduce the working day, week, and year. Now, one of the keys to actually making a policy like this work is to give people more freedom to choose their own working hours. In France, the government tried to legislate a shorter working week, and it was very unpopular. The policy did not work very well. In the Netherlands, however, the government has simply given people the right to reduce their working hours. And because of this, each year, the Dutch now have roughly 6 weeks of extra leisure time compared to people in Britain, and 11 weeks compared to people here in Portugal. Maybe it's time we all move to the Netherlands. Fourth thing we need to do is rethink the way that businesses create value. At the moment, in the world, the dominant form of business is the shareholder-owned corporation. And an interesting feature of the corporation is that it's legally bound to maximize returns for its shareholders. And this is an interest it has to put above other interests. This was very famously demonstrated in 1918 by Henry Ford. Ford had declared that he wanted to employ more men to spread the benefits of the industrial system to the greatest number of people, to help them build up their lives and their homes instead of paying extra money to shareholders. It was a nice idea, but it didn't happen because a court order forced the company to pay the money to shareholders rather than to reinvest it in the way that Ford had wanted to. And today, businesses have become trapped in an overly narrow approach to value creation, which emphasizes short-term profits at the expense of people's long-term needs. In a steady-state economy, businesses need to expand their conception of value to move beyond just generating financial returns to also generate social and environmental returns. And the good news is that there's many businesses that are already doing this. We generally refer to them as social enterprises. You can see a few of the ones in the UK here. And we can help this transition happen by encouraging companies to adopt alternative legal structures beyond the shareholder-owned corporation that are less driven by growth, let's say. Structures such as cooperatives and community interest companies. These types of legal structures allow companies to prioritize social and environmental objectives while still having profit as a secondary motive. And then the final thing we need to do is change the way that we measure progress. At the moment, our main measure of progress is GDP, gross domestic product. But the thing about GDP is it doesn't distinguish between good and bad economic activity. Let me give you an example. Let's say I buy a new bicycle or the government invests in education. Most people would say these are good things. They add to GDP. However, if there is an oil spill, which we have to pay to clean up, that also adds to GDP. If more people start smoking, that actually adds to GDP twice. First, when we sell the cigarettes, and second, when healthcare costs go up. War, crime, environmental destruction, all of these things add to our main measure of national progress. And yet at the same time, GDP doesn't count all sorts of beneficial activities like household and volunteer work because no money changes hands. In a steady-state economy, we need new measures of progress. We need to replace GDP with two sets of accounts, measures of human well-being, such as health, happiness, employment, and equality. These are the things we want to increase. And measures of resource use, like CO2 emissions, material use. These are the things that we want to decrease and keep within ecological limits. Now, I should say that a steady-state economy is not an economy where the goal is zero growth in GDP. It's an economy where what happens to GDP no longer matters. So, will any of these changes ever happen? Well, I'm an economist, not a politician. But it's been my belief that by showing that a steady-state economy is economically possible, that hopefully that makes it more politically achievable. At the moment, we're making decisions based on whether they're good for growth or good for productivity, not whether they're good for people or the planet. We've forgotten that growth is just one means to an end, not an end in itself. But once we let go of our obsession with GDP, we can focus on what really matters: the health of our societies and the ecosystems that contain them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I just wanted to tell you that you stole both my first and second questions, because one of the things that I wanted to talk about was exactly how we need to go beyond the concept of GDP, which we have a lot of young people in the audience, but I think some people tend to forget that GDP as a concept, as a model, has not been around for 100 years yet. So a long time ago, people sat down and they decided we need to find a way to measure growth and in some ways to measure happiness, because we see growth in the same terms as we see happiness. So that was my first question, is do we need to think about different ways of measuring how we progress, which also ties to what you were saying, Tiago, that in your chart, there's the classic way in which we look at energy and the relationship to growth. And if you boil it down to how actually those lines move together, they don't portray an accurate picture. So since my first question was stolen, what I'm gonna ask you is, how do you, and you go around the world, and how do you feel that companies and governments would look at this? What is the appetite to see the economic actors think about a different way of measuring and thinking about growth?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the fellow who basically created the system of accounts upon which GDP is based, Simon Kuznets, he created that system of accounts to try and, in part, get America out of the Great Depression. It was part of the reason, and then it was also very helpful during World War II in maximizing production during the war. And then he became quite alarmed that the system that he created then became used effectively to measure the progress of a nation. And he actually went before Congress in the US and very famously said that a measure of national income should not be used in this way. And so he became quite worried by the sort of Frankenstein's monster that he had created. And this is the fellow who created the system of national accounts upon which GDP is based. And I think it's interesting. I have done some work with policymakers and politicians on this, and I think a lot of them are increasingly aware of these issues, but they're really terrified of what will happen if they stand up in the media and say, okay, we're not going to have GDP growth as our goal anymore. We're going to have human well-being, equality, something like that, because their fear is that the political opposition will then say, well, that's because you can't achieve GDP growth and we can, so you should elect us instead. But there's certainly, I think, a realization among economists and among many policymakers that GDP is a limited measure of progress. But it's a real example, I think, of institutional lock-in, that it's in the system. We have all this architecture built around it. We publish the results. People celebrate it if it goes up, and they're upset if it goes down. And that makes it quite difficult to actually move beyond it politically, even though many of these critiques are not new at all, that we've been aware of these problems with GDP. And so I think it does make it a political challenge, and probably the points of intervention for that, or a lot of people think, are when there's some sort of crisis, that's the point when it's easier to sort of steer the ship than otherwise, because at least then maybe you can think differently about these things. And some of these policies are beginning to be implemented, and so it's not that governments have said, okay, now we're going to pursue a steady state economy, but we have examples of things like a universal basic income. New Zealand is actually using a number of the measures that I talked about, for instance. Working time reduction is happening, as I said, in the Netherlands, and in some companies as well, because of concerns around work-life balance and so on. So I think we are seeing some of these changes, but I think they're also happening too slow for the kind of ecological crisis that we're confronted with.
Yeah, and one of the ways that we see that worry about having other ways of measuring the economy is through ESG, which in Portuguese is Preocupações Ambientais, Sociais e de Governança. So that is permeating into what I always say is the most important thing in the world, which is the economy. I really do believe that, because I think that in some ways that the money will make things happen. It will make things change a lot faster than if we are all just hoping that it happens. But queria também fazer a mesma pergunta ao Tiago e bocadinho.
But I'd like to ask the same question to the Tiago. That is, how could we bring energy and the importance that energy has for economic growth, as is obvious nowadays? How do we place this in an idea of whether or not we are progressing? Well, first of all, maybe I would like to begin by answering before I place energy, then after. And related to what Dan said, it's possible, and there are governments that are doing this, or that is proposing to create the GDP to take into account a number of deficiencies that Dan mentioned, including the deficiencies of not taking into account energy. Now, this is becoming quite mainstream. The Biden administration in the United States has just announced that is going to promote an effort to calculating systematically, that is, for the United States, integrated in the national budget, where the conventional GDP is, and to try and calculate a green GDP that takes into account natural resources, voluntary work, unpaid voluntary work that creates economic value. So it should also be taken into account in the GDP, and so this is possible to do. And we've already calculated this measure for Portugal 14 years, for the last 15 years. And so we've been doing this for 15 years now, as I said. And so the GDP, as it is measured nowadays, is a bad measurement in terms of well-being. So there's an alternative to give it up, and that's a possibility. Then we have the alternative to improve it by incorporating all the measures within the GDP, and this green GDP will be a more appropriate measure in terms of evolution throughout time. That is a GDP that takes into account, if we destroy the environment, then it subtracts it. And so, because they destroyed the environment. So how will the GDP be a better measure than it is nowadays? That is by internalising externalities, as economists say. That is when the companies pay their CO2, or where they're prevented from destroying the biodiversity, when they pay for the consumption of water they make and the pollution of the water they do. That is going to bring about the incur costs. And so, once again, when the companies internalise all the environmental costs, the GDP becomes closer to an appropriate well-being measure. And so I would like to link this to the SCG, which is quite fashionable in terms of major companies. That is to include environmental, social and governance indicators of companies. And so maybe we differ about the optimism of the benefit of this, because I think, and there are others who think, that this is a distraction, and this is something which is often fuzzy, doesn't have any clear objectives, and some of its accomplishment is manipulable in the way the companies report the results. It can be of interest, but there should be the internalisation of externalities. It's much more important for companies, say, whether they emit CO2, but to pay for the CO2 and to have good effects on biodiversity. Well, we don't really disagree. I think it's positive for companies to have a greater concern in this area, but I think this has become a very concrete reality, where such as companies that emit bonds and the stock exchange, and they have a CSG catalogue, and those investment mandates are made based on the fact that we can only invest part of our money in green companies and social companies. And what we see is that, in fact, what we're using to measure these objectives, and quite often we draw the conclusion that theoretically it's very good, but in practically terms it's not so good. This is a path we still have to follow. Going back to the economy and the way and then, or rather energy, which is a preponderant for economic growth, especially now. I would like to ask you, because we quite quickly are moving forward to clean energies. We're going to move forward for sustainability. For quite a few years now, we've been concerned about this, but as soon as the gas flow to Europe was cut, and with everything this implies, not only for us as consumers to heat up our houses, to roast our food, and everything that this implies for our life, but to keep the factories working. And very quickly we went from trying to lower the print to let's use coal to heat up the to get the factories to work, because if there's no destruction then we're fine. So what I'd like to ask is, do you think that we are going too fast, that we want to go to clean energies without giving up fossil fuels, or rather giving up fossil fuels without making sure that clean energies were sufficient to meet our energy needs? And so now we are suffering the consequences of this, or this had to be the path to follow, and nobody expected that. Well, thank you for the question. So allow me to introduce some of the topics that were I didn't mention when I spoke. The use of energy, as I said, is not very well understood by some communities, namely. And so I would like to refine the message that I tried to convey. So energy for economic growth, and it's something that is badly understood in the academic economists, that is those who make the economy and those who appear in the textbooks. And so it's curious that this community of economists is nowadays, it wasn't 20 years ago, but nowadays is the community of academic economists is very sensitive to the problem of climate change and the relevance of meeting these challenges. And so I think you're being unfair if we're criticising those economists that don't care about the environment. This is no longer true. The problem of these the community of academic economists is they're worried about the environment, but they don't understand that energy is fundamental for economic activity. So they put forward solutions that are incompatible. That is, on one hand, there is economic growth, and then there's the reduction of the use of energy. Now, this is wrong, and it contaminated the policymakers of the developed world, namely the European Commission and many European governments, and the inability to understand how fundamental energy is for the creation of economic value in our current model. This was not understood. What is interesting is that many of the movements in our society are against the fight to climate change. They're wrong in that sense, but they are right, because it is not the academic economists, the practitioners. In real society, they've always had the notion of the true value of energy, and they have always said that in order to make it energy transition is going to be very painful. They were the wonders, and they were right. We can disagree with the objectives. That is the way to balance the objectives. So reality, go back to the shop with Ukraine. We know now that in real terms that it's true that energy is essential, and so what was being done was not properly thought out. This does not mean that everything was wrong. No, not at all. Energy transition had to be made, solar energy, wind energy, and it had to be done even quicker. The quicker that it was done, the less we would suffer for the increase of natural gas because of the war in the Ukraine, Germans more than us, but still. But the transition does not happen from one minute to the other, and so the fallacy of ideas that is all black and white. And so we have to make the transition as quickly as possible, point one. But more than this, as it has to be done, we'll do it now, everywhere, and as much as possible. It is unacceptable to exploit fossil fuels in Western countries because, and this is correct, the International Energy Agency and other entities that have made studies that show that in order to comply or to fulfill carbon energy, we would all have the carbon mines and all the natural gas oils that we need to have. So everything that is built after this, some of them are not going to be able to use until the end. And so this is correct up to a certain point. But what is not correct is the fact that for that reason that we don't open any other mine, for example, of fossil fuels, and so we leave the ability to explore that in the hands of regimes which we wouldn't like. So what is unavoidable was the concept which the trendy Bassett concept. We know that if we fulfill carbon neutrality to 2050, these fossil fuel whales are going to be made, are not going to be able to use until 2050, so there'll be a loss. But the question here is, this is going to be obvious, and so should this loss happen in the exploitation of fossil fuels in the West or autocratic countries with which we do not want it, so there's going to be trendy assets and they cannot be used. But this is no novelty. So the whole evolution of developed economies in the last 3 centuries was made at the concrete destruction when trains appeared. For example, the owners of horses went broke, and so they were stranded assets. These carts and horses became stranded assets. So these fossil fuels are going to be stranded, but they're with no value. And this can't be the reason. This is where the mistake is. We should have made the transition quickly, but we should continue with the dependency on fossil fuels, and we should have recognised that this dependency could not, from a geostrategic point of view, to leave us dependent on countries with which we do not want to depend. Yes, it does make some sense, yes. And even more so, we note that when there is a sort of small wave, geopolitical wave in the international scenario, because despite our move towards clean energy, to be better people, to be more environmental friendly, we still depend on the fossil fuels. And the quicker we move forward to the transition to stop being so dependent, the better. Daniel.
About this too, and I wanted to bring something to the table. For a while, we were very recently discussing in the UK whether or not we should resume fracking and to bring some of the shale out of the ground. Does it make sense that we're still doing that because we are still dependent, or as soon as possible cut everything off and bring new ones in?
Basically, it doesn't make sense to continue with fracking, and really it should be the transition to renewables as soon as possible. The longer we wait, the more difficult that it becomes effectively, and the further we get beyond planetary boundaries, and the more difficult it is to deal with these environmental problems. So it does kind of surprise me a bit that the response to the supply chain crisis and to the energy crisis hasn't been more, okay, well, we need to invest, large amounts of money in renewable energy. And I do kind of wonder why that is, right? If the thinking is just so short term that, okay, this energy crisis is going to be over in 6 months and we never have to worry about this again. So, okay, we won't bother with this renewable transition thing, but that's really a very short-sighted way of looking at this, and that problem is not going to go away. And so I think the sooner we invest in that infrastructure for renewable energy, the better, and delaying doesn't help that. And things like fracking, that's not a quick fix either, right? That's not like suddenly we have the natural gas. Those are also very slow projects to bring online. So again, there's not an argument there really. So I don't really see any argument for pursuing that, aside from maybe there's some vested interests or links in the government that are benefiting from this, or it's the only thing they know because the previous prime minister had links to the oil and gas industry. That sort of more cynical view, because in any kind of academic analysis says, okay, we need to do the infrastructure right away for renewable energy.
Yeah. So in other words, let's get through this as best we can and then resume and go as fast as we can on the transition, because we won't be living in this planet without it.
Like there's a bit of a weird macroeconomic cycle in this as well, and maybe this is somehow part of the problem, but we're in a situation where prices are increasing, right? And interest rates are going up. And that's making investment more expensive. So the kind of investment that we need in renewables is becoming more expensive, and maybe that's discouraging that kind of investment. But that creates a vicious cycle, right? Because if you don't have that investment in renewable energy, then you're not going to bring down the costs of energy. So you need to somehow be able to deal with that in order to deal with this inflation issue. But you can see how these forces are perhaps working against each other to prevent what needs to happen from happening, and from happening quickly.
Dois pontos relacionados. Há aqui algo que eu já queria introduzir, talvez para ficar com contexto para o resto da...
So, I'd like to say that clearly we have to look at the different realities. The economic and energy policy, reality of Portugal is not the same as in the UK, the Netherlands or China. We have no source of fossil fuels, so the quicker we do the transition, the better. And because with no war, and even without a war in Ukraine, I mean, natural gas and oil is always create no value in Portugal. We're always importing them, and it should have been quicker in Portugal. It should even be even quicker for the future. In the Netherlands, for example, there is fracking in the Groningen field. That this field was already set up and it is operational, but it was suspended due to the damage to inhabitants around there. We're talking about a couple of thousand, but the Groningen field that is ready to answer and help Europe confront the current war. And we're going to see what things are like in the winter. We're going to see how long are we going to have the support of the European population to our support to Ukraine when things start getting tough. So, in fact, that natural gas field in Groningen in the Netherlands would help us overcome the crisis. And contrary to the example that Dan gave about fracking in the UK, which is total fallacy that the British government conveyed in recent years, that fracking was a solution for the current crisis when the fracking fields, when even we said it was a good idea to do when they were ready in the United Kingdom, the Ukraine war would have finished. So the situations, the realities are totally different, and the strategies that are appropriate for some countries are not necessarily appropriate for others. But another point there to stress on a point that should not be forgotten. The energy transition is not only, and I would say that not mainly, but it's not only transition of the decarbonisation of the energy system, that is stop using fossil fuels and move on to solar or wind energy. It's a transition to increase efficiency of having more efficient equipment, reduce our energy needs. Let's just have more efficient bulbs, cars, etc., to use less energy. This is a major transition. This is more difficult. And so here, for all of you who are here are studying at the university, this is a transition that needs a lot of new environmental engineers, mechanical engineers, managers, architects, because it is, we have to look at each building and factory, house and so forth, and to see how we can how we can improve efficiency. And it's always economic competitiveness which contributes to the energy transition. So competitiveness is another question I would like to ask. I mean, I could spend the rest of the afternoon talking to you, but it's now time for the audience to ask some questions. And so we have one there, another, and another. And I've noticed this when I come back to Lisbon, when I'm landing in Lisbon, is the number of wind farms that we have. And it's quite comforting for me to know that we're actually doing something. Here in the front. I would like to ask a question about the reference to the gas field in the Netherlands. It's an environmental cost for the inhabitants. So, Tiago, Domingos, do you think it's necessary or useful to develop it, but you didn't say what the solution for these environmental problems and health problems is? I think there's a cultural problem here, which is for us to say that we need this, but it's going to take time. The problem is the physics and the planet won't wait. The war happened because the lack of democracy in Russia and the lack of investment in democracy was oriented to develop the exchange of fossil fuels with Russia. So basically here there are values which are abandoned because it's more comfortable to continue in the economic circuits which are oiled and allow for more advantages for some, but not for everybody. Because if we get to the full, once this, because there's always somebody paying the frailer, because we have to keep the higher rents for people who invest, and so this regulation which is missing, and also there's in terms of the cultural. Necessary cultural revolution, what is missing is the question of growth, because it's a false question, because in fact what we actually need is more progress, more prosperity, more human well-being, and so you can't continue to confuse things that are prejudicial. We can't just fix things, we must move forward to energy transition, renewables, and forget all these things to say, oh, it's difficult, it takes time. Well, it takes time because this cultural revolution in terms of values and ethics is slower. Thank you. So this question that we'd already addressed, that growth itself is not the only thing and the only way to look at progress, and the question it's obvious that this field to extract gas from this would have consequences for the population. Here we have to know what is more important. Is the alternatives of not having this gas are not very good either. There are coal plants, etc. So what costs are involved, I believe the lady asked? Well, I'm not really an expert in the gas field in Groningen. I can't give you an answer. I mean, it's typical of the trade-offs. Well, I would have to, in order to give you a good answer, I'd have to make a very careful analysis. I know that it illustrates trade-offs. So the Groningen field was already ready to work, and so contrary to the United Kingdom, which were not ready. And so it's true that the Groningen field affects a number of thousands of people. The war in Ukraine affects millions of people. So this is the type of comparisons that we have to make, first of all. Secondly, to exploit natural gas in Holland is much more favourable for the environment from all points of view than exploit natural gas in Russia or Indonesia, where the environmental control and the activity is much lower. So the natural gas that has to be exploited, I prefer that it's exploited in Holland than in Russia or Indonesia, from an environmental point of view. So, because the code there's a lot tighter control. So there's no doubt that the dependence of the Western world on natural gas and fossil fuels in Russia was something that promoted a certain kind of non-democratic regime. An important note here, we're talking about fossil fuels, and something that has been studied in sociology and political science. The states that are rich in natural resources seem to be blessed by this, but they are not blessed for one simple reason. The states that are rich in natural resources, like Saudi Arabia and Russia, are states where the government can provide well-being for the citizens without the citizens paying taxes. And so think, oh, that's great, not having to pay taxes. It's terrible, because the countries where populations do not pay taxes, countries where the populations are not demanding towards their leaders, so they're a lot less democratic. And this is a force for these countries to remain non-democratic. But this is in the medium and long term. In order to reach the medium and long term, we have to go through the short term. And the reality of the short term is a situation that's politically real. And we know that the difficulties that the war in Ukraine is causing in Europe, it reduces the support of European populations to continue the support to Ukraine, and this is a problem. And I think it's important what we said here. This is a field that is ready, and most of it had already been done, and this allows us to go full speed ahead. Daniel, you quer acrescentar alguma coisa?
I guess I might just add that ultimately no energy source is free of some environmental impact, right? And so whether we're talking about gas fields in Groningen or fracking in the UK, or even building wind farms and solar energy, which would be much better alternatives, none of these things are completely free of an environmental impact, and there are controversies around them. And one of the things which Tiago's work shows so well is just how dependent economic growth is on the use of energy. So long as we continue to maintain our goal of GDP growth for society, that means we have to keep finding more and more energy. And whether it comes from fossil fuels or whether it comes from renewables, we're still going to be confronted with these problems unless we can adapt our economies to live off a constant amount of energy, right? And so otherwise, we're going to continue to be confronted with these problems. And yes, maybe those technologies will be better and renewables will be a lot better than fracking, for example, but it still doesn't completely solve the problem unless we also deal with the economics.
Mais alguma pergunta ali?
Another question?
Olá. Então, o que eu gostaria de trazer.
Right now I'm living next to one of those locations where they want to carry out lithium exploitation, and I had to deal with the environmental impact, huge environmental impact that such a exploitation brings. Which is trying to solve a problem, which the CO2 emissions, because most of this lithium is for electric vehicles. But I realize that something that we believe are supposed to solve a problem, such as CO2 emissions, the crease is creating an even greater impact. For instance, in the north, where they want to make the biggest open mine in Europe, they will cut around 500 hectares of forest, which is already, which is being useful for the decarbonation process. So I believe that it implies a whole change in lifestyle. I believe that many of the CO2 emissions and resource utilization, water resources, is closely linked to the industry, and it has to do with the way we live. We consume a lot, many things which are highly processed and which have a high energy cost. So I'd like to know your opinion about this, and to think about a way of raising the awareness of people so that we will start changing our attitudes. Sometimes there's a very simple attitudes in our daily life, a different way of being, a different way of thinking. For instance, have a wonderful Christmas doesn't mean many gifts, but just being in family atmosphere where you exchange gestures of love and friendship. So I'd like to hear your opinion in relation to this. Well, green energies, of course, it also has an impact, but sometimes we very much focus on CO2 emissions, but some other things have an environment impact which we don't even understand the consequences of. For instance, in lithium exploitation, it requires a huge quantity of water, and Portugal has a huge drought. We have the possibility of investing using a water which is so essential to life for these exploitations. Thank you very much.
This one, Daniel. And I think the general question that we're trying to answer.
A questão geral é: será que nós estamos a consumir demasiado? E
On trying to have more stuff to keep up with what our demand is, do we really need to just stop?
Well, the first question I can answer very quickly, and yes, we are consuming too much. And so it is a question of, well, how do we make that transition? And of course, what I work on is the economics of that, because I think one of the important aspects is we have to adapt the system so that the system can work in a situation where we're not consuming more every year. Because if at the moment we begin consuming less, then the result is a recession, because the economic system is not geared to handle that. But we know now quite well, I think, the policies that we need to change in order to change the economics. So that part, for me at least, as an economist, is easier than how do we change the culture, which I think is your question. But I think what's interesting is I think a lot of people fundamentally understand this basic message that money can't buy happiness, let's say. And there's been a lot of science done on this that shows that the things that genuinely improve people's lives are not generally buying the latest iPhone or buying a bigger television. Those give us a momentary blip in happiness, but the things that give us longer-term happiness are interacting with other people, having friends, experiences. These have a much longer-lasting impact on our well-being. So I think in the 1970s, the environmental movement was really guilty of kind of scaremongering that we have the limits to growth, we're going to run into them, society is going to collapse, you should really do something. But I think the research and the discourse has really changed now because we've realized that living within the limits of a finite planet can also have a lot of social benefits. It can mean that we have a better society where people live better, where people don't have to work as long hours, potentially where people can have higher levels of human well-being. So I tend to think that by communicating the science on that and communicating those messages, that hopefully that makes that cultural transition easier. I think one of the problems, though, is there are vested interests, such as the fossil fuel industry, which are opposed to some of these changes because they will negatively affect them. And so I think you have these sort of battlegrounds being set up over some of these changes that it makes it difficult to change some of these cultural institutions because of that. Yeah. But again, that doesn't mean that we don't need to try and that we don't need to do it. And I think one of the other academic questions, or well, I guess it's not academic, it's a practical question, is whether we can do this through incrementalism or whether it takes some form of collapse or some form of crisis to make these changes happen. And I like to think that we can gradually change things, but I also think it's not a bad idea to plan for, well, if this happens, through crisis. And we're seeing crisis at the moment.
Because we definitely didn't plan for that when it just landed in our laps.
Yeah.
Tiago, já agora queria...
By the way, Tiago, let me ask you something, because I know that you've been working quite a lot in resource utilization and the best way of using these resources so that we can become efficient and that we can take from these resources the best we can with the minimum possible impact. It has to do with mines as well. I know that we've been working in agriculture, studying agriculture. So whatever we do, are we going to do it in the most efficient possible manner? Yes, certainly we're going to do it as efficiently as possible. In relation to mines, I don't know anything. I don't know much. I really know a bit about agriculture and forests. Now, let me just make a comment. You said that the impact is huge. The lithium mines has a huge impact. It's true. It's like running a field. We have to ponder costs and benefits, but we have to be careful with the analysis we make. It's not per se the loss of carbon in the 500 hectares which is relevant. It's a small amount of carbon compared with the carbon to be prevented thanks to all the electrical vehicles that we'll have thanks to this mine. But there are issues, landscape biodiversity, and of course local development. Issues which have to be analyzed. The question of efficiency here something which has not been discussed here. The solutions are not obvious. The question raised because of lithium mines is such an example. Electric vehicles are a great idea. We need lithium, but we are mines which are not a good idea. So this is very complex. In the case of agriculture, which I know quite well, this is exactly the case. We can't try and solve the problems believing that there are good solutions or bad solutions. For instance, extensive agriculture is good, intensive agriculture is bad. This is false. Well, we have no time to explain why. There are ways of extensive agriculture which are terrible. There are ways of intensive agriculture which are very good. Like the opposite is also true. So we can't believe that we're going to solve problems with silver bullets. What I usually say to my students, these are good news, because the fact that the problems are complex means that they require qualified people to understand what the best possible solution is. So I think that's a good solution when, say, that you'll find when people tell you there's a complex question. But there's a basic issue, consumption, that Dan answers, and it has to do with what Dan was telling us. If we scale down the type of society we've got, where simultaneously we will need to consume less, and then we don't have to work so much, so there will be no unemployment, this is an interesting scale down. But and then I would say, although I'm against simple ideas to solve problems, but this is a simple idea that makes sense. But again, it has to be analysed thoroughly and on a case-by-case basis. In Portugal, because of the lack of economic growth in Portugal, we have hundreds and thousands of qualified Portuguese who are going abroad because they can't find a job. This is clearly a failure of our society.
Se resolve com crescimento económico.
Can this be solved with economic growth? Maybe not. We have to find different ways of tackling with this, but it's not the same to discuss lack of economic growth in Portugal, where young people have no jobs, they go abroad, they have no money to afford an apartment, or discuss it in Germany, where the average level of the income level of the population is much higher. There is no significant public debt, neither a significant external debt. So, if the discussion would relate to Germany, there are many arguments to believe that Germany does not have to keep on growing economically. Portugal, to be able to pay the debt, to create some dynamism, to create jobs, to recover all the qualified young people who left the country, it will need for some time some economic growth, the conventional economic growth. But maybe in the future we'll make a transition into a steady state economy, as Dan was telling us about. A final note. In relation to the vested interests mentioned by Dan, it's frequently pointed out that what is blocking our climate commitments is the resistance of the sector, which will lose if this is attained, which is the fossil fuel sector. But the fossil fuel sector is not that big. It's true, it's a group of lobbyists which oppose transition. The fundamental issue doesn't lie here. The fundamental issue lies in the whole structure of society based upon growth. And this requires energy. And because we need energy, well, we do. So it's the whole society which is resisting change, because all the energy is used to a way of life that requires a great deal of energy. By the way, in terms of for the vested interests in Portugal, we don't have vested interests in the fossil fuel sector. The most significant resistance to transition in Portugal, a much more relevant sector, is real estate, the price of houses and land. This is the sector which truly has a huge economic impact, which leads to the increase of the price of the real estate, and the reason why without economic growth we can't keep young people here. And the sector of real estate is one of the best examples. If the real estate had reasonable price in Portugal, we would have a few of these young people living in Portugal, because the salary needed to afford the house would not be so high. Let me go back to the fact that different countries have different problems. This is the hill that I'm gonna die on. Figures are not people. Economy is not figures, but economy is people. What we do as economic agents matters. So this is what makes up our economic performance. So our choices as consumers really make the difference. Well, I'm really late, so I'd just like to have a final answer. No, I'm afraid it's not possible. No, we're too late. So very quick answer, very quick reply, please, because
When Daniel talks about reducing working time, you mean people are working less in a way that slows down the global economy and the decrease or desire to consumption, even because the technology can help the people reduce their workload, or no?
There's different proposals for how working time reduction might work. The one that I talked about was basically using improvements in productivity to reduce working hours instead of to produce more things. And so that's one way of doing it, but you could also reduce working hours beyond the gains in productivity, but doing so would then mean you were earning less, for example. And there's been some interesting surveys that have been done on this. And so some very famous surveys asked people, would you prefer, basically, if we took the benefits of technological progress and gave you a higher salary from that, or allowed you to reduce your working time for that? And if you ask people that, about 80% of people will actually take the reduction in working time. Now, if you instead say to people, okay, we're going to give you the choice to reduce your working hours, we're not going to talk about productivity anymore. This is like, not a year from now, this is right now. Do you want to reduce your working hours and take a pay cut? Do you want to increase your working hours and work more and make more money, or do you want to stay the same? And you get about, in that scenario, which is the one I didn't talk about, you get about 50% of people say keep things the same, 40% say reduce working hours and I'll take a pay cut, and about 10% say increase working hours and allow me to make more money. And so again, even using that proposal, if we gave people more freedom to reduce their working hours right now, that would actually help deal with this issue of unemployment, because you would have a significant number of people, you'd have more people reducing their working hours than increasing their working hours, which across the economy as a whole would create more employment opportunities and allow you to lower unemployment. So there's these different ways that working time reduction could be implemented, whether it's in the long term about what we do with the benefits of technological progress, which was what I mostly talked about, or just giving people more freedom right now to adjust their working hours to match their preferences.
Okay. Obrigada. Tiago, queria dizer alguma coisa?
Era só uma pequena
Tiago, an additional note.
questão de tempo de
To focus on the importance of working hours when there is no increase of productivity. And in relation to what I've explained to you today, actually what the historical analysis tells us about the past is the productivity of work only increases when the farmer uses 100 horsepower tractor than 1 horse. So we increase productivity at the cost of more energy. So in terms of reconciling social and environmental targets, we have to think about situation then talked about no increase in productivity. These will imply more energy consumption, but people just scale down and assume that I'm going to have less working hours, like life-work balance. And a final note, which is implicit in what Dan said, but he didn't say it explicitly, and important to say so, the reduction of working hours, when we talk about this, we're not necessarily talking about people who during their career will now work 90% of the time, or 100% of the time. They may work 100%, but when they have children or a sick relative, they work 0%. So in average, they work 80%. Have to think that reduction of working hours covers all the situations. I will now close the Q&A. I'm sorry, I'm going to be very brief in what I wish to say. We started this discussion talking about 3 things: economic growth, looking at it just in terms of GDP is not enough. There is a series of other things which have to be included so as to have a true idea of what progress means. May include work less, to find ways of consuming less. There are things that we can change. In relation to energy, It's clear how important it is, how much we depend on energy for everything in life, basically, and how we have to speed up energy transition so that more and more we'll be able to move on without endangering physical resources in our future. Sustainability. We only have one planet and one opportunity of making things right. So the sooner, the better. The sooner we rationalize our use of energy and the way we create progress, the better. Thank you.
E agora, pedem-me para dizer que no foyer há um coffee break, por favor.